I want to share with you now the things just kind of, and I told you, I feel pretty comfortable here, and I feel I have a right to feel comfortable because you've made me feel comfortable. You know, it's not something I said, this is I demand. It's something that you've embraced me. My wife has been here. And so I feel at home here. So I can share some things that are pretty important. And as I pray through this and get ready, I want to talk to you about the concept of what Nehemiah brought to us. Now, first of all, from a historical standpoint, Nehemiah, many say, could be Ezra too, because the prophet Ezra was there. And many feel like that he actually wrote a good part of the book of Nehemiah. Wrote a large part of it. There are some personalization that you know came directly from Nehemiah, but the book itself was probably put together and drafted by Ezra, who was a part of this and the rebuilding of the walls that took place there. And I believe that the rebuilding of the walls is more than just a study of a city there, that we need to see God's favor and we see all of these things, but I believe it applies to our churches for today. Because I believe the principles for rebuilding us lead us to the point of understanding what's our role in this as a rebuilder. Do we have a role in this? And our church is needing to be rebuilt in a sense. You know, because we look out here and your building is very solid. So if we say rebuilding the walls, you go, you know, it's really fine. I'm good with that. But when we talk about a spiritual rebuilding and the climate of spiritually rebuilding, it takes on the same principles that Nehemiah laid out, or Ezra and Nehemiah laid out for us. And I want to walk you through some things that are just pretty key for me in this. And I look at this and I talk about the purpose of, or I think about, what's the purpose of rebuilding? Why do we even need to consider rebuilding? Whether it's a physical structure or rebuilding in terms of a spiritual climate, okay, and a safe place. And the first thing that for me is it's for God's glory. Anything we do for our glory is not going to last. We know that, don't we? But when we look at this, and God's pretty clear about who he allows to build, isn't he? You know, he was very clear that he told David, you can't build the temple. That will be done by your son. You're allowed to gather things, but you are not allowed. We should listen to that. I think that's pretty significant. Because when God allows us to build a place, we should take that as a very serious assignment from God, different than just saying, oh, why don't we plant a church? You know, that's not like a great idea. But when God allows you to be a part of building his house, that's a very special privilege that God doesn't allow everyone to do. As we saw with a man after his own heart, David wasn't allowed to build God's temple. So we understand that the rebuilding, the church, and that term church, we need to get this right. Church is a German word or comes from a German word. It's not really what God intended as we use it, the church in terms of the building. That really the word, when Jesus said to Peter, you know, who am I? Upon this rock I will build my church. That word is not the original text. The original is ecclesia, which means the following. Okay, the disciples of, those with the right heart, mind, and spirit behind Christ, not the building that they were in, because then there were no buildings as such. All of the meetings took place with his followers in upper rooms and in homes and things like that. The word church, as the word basilica, didn't really come into play in terms of the church till after Constantine made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire in 314. In fact, if you're in Rome, you can still go by and look at the house where they believe Constantine went to church, in the home church that still from a foundational still sits there. So it was after that that political elites, in a sense, said, well, we've got to have a building then. If this is going to be, you know, it's kind of like the city building, and they begin building these massive temples and these massive basilicas and so forth. But what Jesus said was his following, the ecclesia, the followers of Christ, upon this, I will build the multitudes who will follow me and change the world. It's what he was really saying. And what God's allowing us to be a part of is his vision and his purpose that he's given us. So what we do is for God's glory there. And the second thing in terms of rebuilding is it creates a safe place for return. You're here. You know, at the time of the rebuilding of the walls in Jerusalem, we talk about Nehemiah, the remnant lived there. So they weren't rebuilding the walls for the remnant that was there. The people that stayed, they were rebuilding the walls so it was a safe place to come back to and to come to, creating a safe place for the followers of Christ in the holy city. That's different than saying, we're going to stay here, it's us four and no more, build the walls around us. That wasn't what the intent was. The intent of rebuilding the walls was to build a safe place for all who had been dispersed, that were all over the land, that were in other places, who had previously called Jerusalem home, and those that wanted to come back. Now remember, there had been many, many years, so the ones there, when the city was intact, it was their ancestors that was there when everyone was dispersed. No one in that generation had ever experienced Jerusalem with the walls completely assembled and with the city thriving like it was. But what's the results then when we say, okay, we know what the purpose is, but what do we anticipate in the results there? There's three things: is safety and protection. That those walls give a sense of safety and a protection that surrounds them. The second thing it does is it provides identity for them. You ask somebody, where are you from? And we live in a larger city, kind of, sort of, almost, maybe, but not really. In Littleton, did you even get that? See, she's following me there. See, she says, I got grandkids. I understand what he's saying. Okay? All right? But the reality of it is, we say Littleton is where I live, but I don't hardly ever say that, unless somebody pins me down and say that. But we just say Denver. It's part of a larger community, and people know where that's at. But there's an identity that goes with that. The homes that we have, the communities that we live in. When you say Enumclaw, you have a community here that provides you identity. So it gives you the safety, protection. It gives you an identity, a place to call home in a sense. And it gives you a community of like-minded people that are in there. So we can say, this is our community. And then we look at, there's three things that I look at for the rebuilder: the heart, the spirit, and the mind. And when I look at the heart of this, it's different in a sense. That the heart, and let me just kind of give you some of the scriptures on this as we begin this. Nehemiah, when the book of Nehemiah starts out, in the very first, it says the words of Nehemiah and so forth. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while he was in the citadel of Susa, and you can look on maps and see that, one of the brothers came from Judea with the other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant. That was the people that had stayed back with the walls and the gates burnt down in Jerusalem. And there they were. And I questioned about it. And they said, those who survived the exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. Interesting words, aren't they? He didn't say they were living in fear. They were hiding out into the rubble there. But they were in great trouble. But the other word is disgrace. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down. They've lost their identity. They've lost their sense of community. They've lost their sense of protection and safety in that. And he says the walls of Jerusalem are broken down. Its gates have been burned. Now here's the first thing with Nehemiah. Sometimes you think about this and you hear of something that takes place, and immediately what riles up inside of you is this: let's change that. That's just wrong. I can fix that. That's not what happened to Nehemiah as a rebuilder. When I heard these things, I sat down and I wept. Now understand, it was probably Nehemiah's grandparents or great-grandparents that had lived in Jerusalem. Neither Nehemiah or his parents had ever lived there, because the disperse had taken place in the exile that had happened there. But yet, there was still this spiritual connection to that. And he says, when I heard these things, I sat down and I wept. And then he goes on to say, for some days, a continuing period of time, I mourned. You can use that word like the grief or the loss of something. People that suddenly lose something, there's a grief that happens there. He says, I mourned, but then it goes on, interestingly enough, because the two words, mourning is one of those things that indicates of that internal feeling, and you kind of retreat back into that. I'm mourning, I'm grieving. But then there's an outward expression of that. He says, and I fasted and prayed. And so when you look at this, she said, it's one thing when you go through something, somebody just kind of cuddles up in the fetal position and say, woe is me, kind of thing. This is too tough, and why did this happen? And you go through. But then there is an outward expression of that requires on your part to make a decision and take action. Prayer requires you to make a decision and take action. It's not a natural thing for us. We have to say that there is some value to do that, isn't it? What happens with people that are weak in their faith and bad things happen, they quit praying. Others have to pray for them. But to say, I'm going to pray and I'm going to fast is a decision of action on your part. And so Nehemiah said that he prayed and he fasted. He mourned for several days, but he prayed and then he fasted. And then he began to pray. The prayer in chapter 1 is a remarkable prayer because what happens there is Nehemiah takes responsibility for something he had nothing to do with. Isn't that an interesting thing? He takes responsibility and he asks God to forgive him for something that physically he had nothing to do with and was actually 1 or 2 generations removed from the sin that had caused the dispersion and for them to go into exile. Wow. You think about that. For so often, and even in our churches, people want to take responsibility reluctantly for the things they can say that was pinned on them. Okay, I made a mistake, fine, I'll take responsibility for that. But to say as a church that in this community, we're not doing what we need to do to reach this community, rarely does a church as a group of people say, I'll take responsibility for that. That's a leadership issue. Other people need to step up. Yeah, if there's a program, all that. But I want you to think about this. What Nehemiah did was he took responsibility for the conditions of which he had nothing to do with technically, but he knew broke God's heart. I am convinced that churches, down to the individuals, who are willing to take responsibility for the condition, the spiritual condition of their community, and ask God to forgive them, even though they may be able to say, but I didn't do that. But we're responsible together as an ecclesia following our Christ for the spiritual condition of our communities. I am convinced that the churches that are willing to do what Nehemiah did there, God will honor that. God will honor that. And it cannot be him saying, God, go ahead and forgive them for what they did because I wasn't around and my parents wasn't around, so we're not responsible for the conditions here. There are conditions in Enumclaw and on the plateau for which you personally are not responsible. Personally not responsible. Couldn't be pinned on you. You couldn't be found guilty in a court of law for those conditions. But there are hurting people that are part of the spiritual climate here that I believe to rebuild in a sense. I believe a church needs to take responsibility for the spiritual climate of this area and ask God to forgive us for the spiritual climate in this area. For the single mothers, the hurting people, the dads that don't know how to father. I mean, you got to have a license to drive a car, and let me just say this in love. Well, you can't say this in love, but any idiot can become a father, But it takes more to drive a car. To get a hunting license, it takes so much more than to just become a father, But there is a climate, a spiritual climate in this community that I believe the church, the ecclesia, my family here at the Summit, I think you've got to take responsibility for the spiritual climate here. And I believe if you will do that, down to the individual as well as the composite group, I believe God's going to honor that. But here's the next thing that happened. When you start off in chapter 2, it says, in the month of Nisan, the 20th year. Now, as the best that I can figure, that was about 8 months. Because very often, and when we read these things, if we don't study it enough to understand that, we have this tendency to think, okay, God broke my heart with this, fine, tell me what you want me to do. Missionary comes in and children are dying in Africa and all of this. Okay, tell me what you want me to do. I write a check, I can't go there this week, but just tell me what you want me to do. And we want to have this immediate response. With God tells us what to do, we do it and we're done with it, right? Well, that's not what happens always. When Nehemiah said he mourned and he fasted and he prayed, but then when you read ahead, it was like 8 months later before he's there in the presence of King Artaxerxes, and the king looks at him and opens the door. The king looks at him and opens the door and he says, why do you look so forlorn? Why are you down in the face and you're looking so sad? And he says, there's that moment. But he was ready when God opened the door. And he says, you too would probably be sad if the land of your family was in ruins and the walls had been torn down and the gates had been burned. And just like that, the non-believer, the king, says, what do you want me to do? What do you need? This is really an important issue for me. And because here's what I think, and I kind of learned a good lesson on this several years ago. And that was, Nehemiah, upon hearing the condition that broke his heart, didn't demand from God to say, okay, show me what you want to do and I'll do that right then. But he stayed in an attitude until God opened the door. But when God opened the door, it was effective because Nehemiah had earned the right to speak to the king. And you know, as Christians, very often, we don't consider this part about earning the right to speak. I've got Jesus, you need Jesus, let me tell you the truth. We have a tendency to get the truth before the love because it's actually the order it comes in the Bible, but it's just a different issue. Truth and love means that it's the truth, but it's surrounded first by the love. And we have a tendency to think, I have the truth, you need the truth, here it is, take it or leave it. But there's a part of this that tells us we have to earn the right to be able to speak. Several years ago, I had the privilege of speaking in this booming little metropolis of Bethalto, Illinois. You all know where it's at, kind of the crossroads of the Midwest. But they have an old airfield there. And one of the things that Cornerstone Church, at the time, Pastor Philip Snyder, he's now the district superintendent for that denomination for the entire state of Illinois, and that. But they had rented a good portion of this old airfield. And they put on a carnival, and they were pretty slick about this thing. It was done the weekend before the 4th of July because everybody was in town. And nobody was doing anything because everybody waited till the big 4th of July piece of this, right? So he had a captive audience. And they threw this huge carnival. Estimate that between $10,000 and $12,000 was spent to put this together. And the individual people, you know, they would buy candy and they had booths and they had stuff for all the kids. They had the rides, they had all of this stuff and put it together. And on the 3rd year that this was taking place, I was invited to be there. It was pretty interesting because they would have a flatbed and they had music going and stuff. And periodically through the day then, I would be invited up, introduced, and have a chance to speak on patriotism, God and country, and things like that. But on the morning as they were getting ready to do it, their pastor was encouraging them, and Phil said, he said, we've earned the right this year to tell them who we are. You know what I hadn't realized? For the first 2 years, they never put their church name on anything. They just threw a party to celebrate and invited the entire community, blasted it out on the radio and everything else, and hundreds of people came through this. They never had their church name on anything. And all of the booths, everything, filled by people of their church. And in the 3rd year, he made this statement. I believe as your pastor that we now have earned the right to just tell them who we are. And you know, I look back on my own life and I wonder, you know, in my enthusiasm as a young Christian, less young, I mean, you can go through all of this, and even as an older, you would say maturing Christian, right? But how many times in my enthusiasm had I spoken out in situations I hadn't earned the right to speak? And I think as a church, we need to earn the right to speak when God opens the door for that. And we earn the right to speak by taking responsibility and ownership on the spiritual climate. I stayed, where did I stay? Park City? Park Center, yeah. And I get up this morning and go in and get coffee, and there's a very nice young lady there, I'm believing a single mom. She says, what are you doing here and so forth? And I said, well, I'm getting a lot of coffee because I'm speaking at the summit today. She goes, oh, I love that church. I love that church. I said, is that your home church? She says, no, I don't go there. True story, 6:30 this morning. She helped me clean up after I spilled a cup of coffee too. Really nice. She says, I love that church. And I said, your church? She said, no, I don't go there. I says, how do you know that church? How do you love that church? She says, oh, Pastor Herb. She says, I love him. I says, you don't go to the church, but Dad? I said, okay, you got me. She says, well, I want to go to church. But I have a son that's 13 that's special needs, and he has this phobia, whatever, that in large spaces and crowds, that he goes into a panic attack. And I've wanted to go to church, so the summit was where I tried. And she says, I got there, and she says, and he had a panic attack, and I had to take my son home. She says, but all I remember was Pastor Herb. Pastor Herb took care of us. And she says, when I can get my son to go back to church, I want to go to the summit because of Pastor Herb. And I said, Pastor Ross? And she says, who's he? True story. I didn't tell him that till I got to this point here. But here's my point. You know that part about all of you having a responsibility in the body of believers? A young lady with her 13-year-old son, a single mother, came to this church. Her son had a panic attack, and all she knows was there was a man that loved her son, and did everything he could. And even though she had to leave, I will tell you now, he's earned the right to speak into her life, and he didn't know it until this morning, and I don't know who her name is. God does, and he's going to bring her back with a 13-year-old son. But I tell you that because you have the opportunity for those encounters with people to earn the right to speak into their life, whether it's at Starbucks or it's a grocery store or it's waiting in line. You have that opportunity to take ownership and responsibility for the spiritual climate when God opens the door for you. And I'm sure with Herb, he didn't know anything about it till this morning. Probably he's not real sure he remembers all the details of it, to be honest with you, because my guess in knowing Herb is he doesn't see himself as doing anything different or out of the ordinary except being a part of this church and doing what he thought God was telling him to do. And in his mind, if you said, gee, Herb, that was great, he goes, oh, that was really nothing. It was nothing in the sense it was nothing out of the ordinary for how the man has chosen to live his life and take responsibility for the summit and for the spiritual climate of this community. It's a pretty great statement, isn't it? Hey, Herb, thanks, partner, because she treated me in a wonderful way because what you did and how you treated her and her son. It's a pretty neat thing, isn't it? So as we look at this, now we go back to this. Now let's talk about the elements of the spirit and the mind in that, and I'll touch on this very quickly. First of all, the heart of a rebuilder. And I want to, if we come out of here, which we will eventually, I guess we're not done till 3 here because nobody's going to see the game. It's on now. And nobody wants to know the score because most of you DVR'd it, so it's not a big deal. I think that as a rebuilder, we've got to be brokenhearted. I think that we've got to ask God to break our hearts with the things that breaks his. Just to be informed about something and said, okay, fine, I'll do it. I don't think that's what God is asking for. I think God is asking for the Nehemiah spirit to first realize to be brokenhearted over the conditions of the community. And I would say be brokenhearted because, look, as a church, you've been through an awful lot, haven't you? And not just one thing or two things. As a church, in the past year, my goodness, you've been through a lot, haven't you? And from afar in various places, I've been praying for you and praying for your pastor and praying for you. But my goodness, been through an awful lot. And in some ways, I think some of you feel like you're kind of a remnant here, aren't you? And I don't mean old. I'm talking about a remnant that we're hanging on here. We believe in this church. We know this church. And God has so much more for this church than what we're seeing right now. And you know, the part of that, too, when you're brokenhearted, and the other part of that is that you take responsibility and you act out of obedience. That the rebuilder, Nehemiah, didn't act out of obligation. He was brokenhearted. He took responsibility. And when God opened the door, he didn't act out of obligation or that he was forced. He acted out of obedience to God. And I believe as rebuilders, we act from the brokenhearted to the responsibility, but we act out of obedience to God. And when you're obedient, there's a great joy in that, isn't there? The second thing on the spirit here, the issue of the spirit is this idea of vision. It struck me that when Nehemiah went and he looked at the city and the walls were torn down, he didn't get a vision for it from the inside out. He got a vision by going at night and going to the hillside and looking back onto the great city. I want to suggest to you, if you want a vision for your church, don't stay inside here. and look at the sanctuary and the nursery and the hospitality room, and this isn't where you're going to get a vision for your church. You're inside the church. You know what it looks like from in here. Step out and cross the street and go into a parking lot and stand on the corner and look and see if you can get a vision for this church. Because that's what Nehemiah did when his heart was broken and said, God has so much more for us. God has so much more. But I want to suggest to you, you're not going to get the vision for what God has for you inside here. You're going to get the vision for this church outside there. What it looks like when you drive by it. What it looks like when you stand and you see this and say, but God wants this place filled, not for our glory, but for his glory. And whether it's opening the doors to single moms, whether it's opening the doors to people in need, whether it's growing the church, and when I say reaching a generation, very often we misunderstand. We talk about reaching a generation, we talk about younger people. I want you to get a grasp that a generation that God wants us to reach is a new generation that are currently non or marginal believers that come in all ages, all sizes, all shapes, and all colors. You see, because when we talk about a new generation, my father didn't come to know the Lord. Now get this, he had been a member of 3 different churches in his lifetime. And no one asked him if he knew Jesus. And it wasn't until on that day, a month before his 70th birthday in Wichita, Kansas, my father and I kneeled down on the floor together. And he wept and invited Jesus Christ into his heart and surrendered his life to Jesus Christ a month before his 70th birthday. And he'd been a member of 3 different churches. My father is part of a new generation when he was alive until he went to be with the Lord. And I know he's there now, because he was part of a new generation the church should have been going after. Not just a generation of young people in the youth group or young married couples, because that's what we need is the younger people. Yes, we do. But we need everyone that doesn't know Jesus and has never known the saving grace of a God that sent his son to die for us. That's a new generation of believers in this community. And those are single moms. Those are married people trying to raise kids. Those are retired people that don't know what to do with their life now. And what an amazing opportunity we have here at the summit to get a vision for this generation and a church that throws open its doors for people, some of which don't have anything to offer except their life to Jesus. What an amazing gift. So we've got to get a vision for this in leadership and take responsibility for this in the community. And the other part of this is what really got me with Nehemiah was there's a big difference between being invested in something and taking ownership in it. And here's what I think. I think in many of our churches, we have a lot of people who would say they're invested in the church. But when you draw the line and say, but do you take ownership on the church? There's a different issue. And I believe for the spiritual climate of this community, you've got to take ownership on this community. You've got to take ownership for what's taking place in the stores and the schools and all of the other places. There's an ownership issue that's different than an investment. When you invest in something, you risk a little money on it and you hope to get a return. But when you take ownership on it, it changes everything, doesn't it? They're putting up a building across the street and you invest in it, you want it to do well. But not always does an investment return on investment what you would like to have from it. But if you take ownership of the building, it changes everything, doesn't it? What I want to suggest to you here is you need to take ownership on this community. You want to take ownership on this community, not just be invested in it, but take ownership on this. Now here's the final part that really, you know my heart and the passion for intergenerational. I want to invite you all to read chapter 3 of Nehemiah. It's a good book. You can read the whole thing, actually, and nobody will be upset with you. No, really, it is a good book, right from the very beginning to the end. It's an amazing book. But I want you to read chapter 3 specifically. If you don't get it the first time, read it the second. Because here's what you get. And I'm just going to touch the highlights of this. Because we've got to get who was involved in the rebuilding of this. we have a tendency to think those are the people that have these great gifts to do this specific thing, and that doesn't include us. We're not gifted enough for that, right? It's like, by the way, the Renaissance Man is with Danny DeVito, Herb. That was just a sideline. At my age, it comes up at any time. I don't know how it happens. But it's really a great movie that you need to see. It's 20 years old, Danny DeVito, Renaissance Man. And that may tell you a little bit more about who you really are there too, okay? It's a good book. It's really good, really good. And it fits well at this time. In fact, many of you ought to see it. But let's go back and look at this in terms of who were the rebuilders? Everyone. I'll just hit some of the highlights of this. Here were the rebuilders of the wall. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priest went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. And then they dedicated and so forth. And then the men of Jericho, they built the adjoining sections. Once the gate went up, then they built the adjoining section. I'm just going to skip over. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of a man who laid it and so forth. But next to him, another one of the sons took the sections that were adjacent to that. And then it goes on. The next section was built, interestingly enough, was built by this group, the men of Tekoa. But their nobles wouldn't work with them. So the men did it themselves. Another gate was repaired by the son of Pashua and Melisam, son of, and all of these names. It should be like Bob, Jack, John, and Fred, but they really mess us up here, and you got to follow through all of this stuff. But then the men of another group repairs here, and then the men of another group repaired here. And then, get this, Uzziel, son of Harakiah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section. And then Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, took the next section. And then Rebiah, the son of Hur, whose father was the ruler of half of the district there, he grabbed a bunch of men and repaired another section. Now, a lot of times in the Old Testament, ladies, you get kind of a bad rap on this, and you don't get full credit for what you do, don't you? I mean, why don't we just tell the truth and shame the devil? You know, it was kind of a man's world back then. You say, well, you know, fine, none of that really applied to me. You know, if he'd have said women, then we would have read that part. You know what I mean? But it was all about the men. But I love this here, because Shallum, the son, ruler of half of another district, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. And here's the picture that you get, and we could go through this whole thing. There were specific assignments that were made, and the priest took this gate, and then this other ruler took this gate, and they would get the gates up and so forth. And then all of a sudden when that happened, almost spontaneously, men would come along with a group of men, and they'll say, okay, we'll take this section. When the gate was in place, we'll take this section here. And then what you saw happening when you read it carefully is people would get up, look outside their front door, and see work needed to be done, and they would step out and they would just start repairing the wall in front of their house. And then groups of people, whether it was the perfume maker, you know, crazy, the goldsmith, you know, and how many think a goldsmith with all the delicate work, and this would be a guy that, along with others, would start lifting these big rocks and rebuilding the wall and so forth. Yet it was everyone looking out and saying, there's a part of this that I can do. Everyone there looked out and said, you know what? There's a part of this for me. There's a part of this. Not that I can do, I should be doing this. And it wasn't that people waited till they were asked to do things. They look, and because of the ownership they took in their city, they immediately did what was necessary. I talked to a pastor one time, and he says, you know what I did when he went into a new church just to kind of get the climate of it? Because very often churches grow up and we have this consumer mentality that says, what's the church going to do for me? Here's where I need to be served. The church was never meant to be a place to train people so that they could be served properly. It was never meant for that. The church was meant to train us to serve others. And the idea that all we do is serve those that are in our church is ludicrous. That's not of God. The church, the ecclesia, the following of Christ, everything Jesus taught was about how when we were trained up and in Christ, what that did was want us to serve others. Not sit back and say, well, what are you doing to serve me this week? It's a tragic thing where the church has come at different times, hasn't it? But this is about us as a family saying, this building here, this group is really existing to get me better to reach those out there, those that are hurting. Because what happens is if it's about the remnant that's here, we get pretty complacent in this. And frankly, what it leads to is we just don't want to change much. How many times did Herb say, being pushed or pulled, kicking and screaming into the 21st century? And we laughed at it, but the fun part is he's doing what he needs to do. And he would probably tell you, he and I are about the same age, 130, 132, Herb, right in there. A lot of these things don't fit well with us. And being complacent, we would just as soon leave things the way they are in a sense because we're frankly doing fine. But the changes that need to be made aren't to reach us. We're here. The changes that need to be made, whether it's new technology and whether it's things that's happening that frankly I've got to get somebody 19 to help me with. Thank you. 18, 17. My granddaughters, 15, 16 now. I have an app on my phone that I use because my granddaughter says, Papa, if you want to talk to me, you need this. Instagram, here I come, boom, and I'll get a picture, and I have 10 seconds to watch this thing or whatever it is. But the generation, now remember this, the generation isn't just the younger people and that. The generation is that we've got to reach across the spectrum. The generation that God has called us to reach is the generation of unbelievers, marginal believers, those, and they come in all ages, shapes, sizes, and colors. And God wants his family to reach the rest of the family. And so when we did this, and you look at this, and I kind of come back to Nehemiah for just a second. One is, I want to tell you two things about this. They got tired rebuilding the wall, and they weren't sure if they could go on. So you don't read that often. Boy, when we're in Christ, there's never a doubt. Seriously? What Bible are you reading? God's people get tired. God's people question, are you moving in the right direction? God's people question, am I still the one God wants to use to do this? And by the way, God doesn't make any mistakes on it. But he says, meanwhile, this is in chapter 4, there was opposition. And when the wall got halfway up, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out. And there's so much rubble, we cannot rebuild the wall. And it was then that they pulled back and they said, but yet we have to, because for God's glory, this is what he's called us to. And Ross and I left. John was with us. We left yesterday. Do you know at that time, Jay, and other men were picking up trash and vacuuming the church that we had used. Now, let me just say this in love. I watched men that were really, really talented at a lot more things than I'm talented at. And if you said, yeah, but we really need them to vacuum and pick up trash. In many of our cultures, we say that's kind of beneath them. That's not something we need them to do. We'll get other people to do that. We need to use them to the full amount of their skills and everything. No, there's times when, regardless of our stature in life, we need to be vacuuming or picking up trash if that's what needs to be done. You thought I forgot about this pastor I was going to tell you about at my age. It just slipped away. When he started off in a church, he literally would walk along and throw some trash on the floor. He did it intentionally to see who was going to pick it up. He said because in a previous church he was at, The trash could lay there for weeks and nobody would pick it up because there was an attitude that that's a janitor's responsibility. We hire somebody to do that. Well, if you hire somebody to pick up the trash, why would you bend over and pick up a piece of trash? Can I tell you? If you own a building, you take ownership, you bend over and pick it up, don't you? If you just invested in it, then you hire somebody to do that. It's a big difference, isn't it? The final thing that I will tell you here is that the wall was completed in 52 days, well ahead of anything that could have been done. Wasn't even possible, 52 days. But here's the really cool part. Do you know what happened after that? So many people wanted to come back to the holy city, they couldn't handle them all. And they had to do a lottery. And 1 out of 10 was allowed to come in. When they rebuilt the walls where there had just been a remnant, and they honored God, and they confessed their sins, and they took ownership, they could only accept 10% of those that wanted to come back to the community, identity, and safety of what they had done. Can you imagine that? Well, we're here at the summit, and we're running our 7 services, and what we'd like you to do is if you'd like to put your name in a basket, and those names we draw out, if you'd wait in the parking lot, we'll tell you who gets to come in. Because you know we have limited space. You say that doesn't happen at churches. David Youngie Cho, his church in Seoul, Korea, got to about 700,000, and they were running 18 services a week. And they begged their people to only come to one, because if their people came to more than one service, they wouldn't have enough room for guests. What a terrible problem. And I'm just suggesting to you, one, I love you. And I mean that sincerely. I love you as a church. I love you individually. And to be back here with you is always an honor for me. I want to encourage you to take ownership on this community. To see the responsibility you have as an owner of the spiritual climate of what God has called you to here. And in many ways as a remnant, in a sense, in the community or perhaps in the church, but as a remnant, to rebuild the spiritual walls of this church, to begin rebuilding the spiritual walls of this community, to create a safe place for people to return to spiritually and physically, to take responsibility for what goes on in this church and for your section, to look for opportunities, not to be asked or told. Because when you look for opportunities just to do something, I want you to think about that. If just 1/10 of the people here in our family who were not assigned to do anything on a Sunday morning, 1/10 came through the doors and began looking for what needed to be done to make this a safe place, and just did that, how different would it be? And that's not an indictment or a negative statement about what you're doing. It's just one of those what ifs for God that we walk in. And I told the guys yesterday, my wife and I, since I came to know the Lord, have never had an argument. It's a lot of years. We've had some pretty significant emotional experiences. I told my son that. Our youngest son, is married 1 year today. Told him how proud I was of him, and that reminded him that his mother and I had never had an argument since he was born. But we had had some significant emotional experience. One occasion left a hole in a door and some things like that on a wall. And I'm not saying you which one of us did that. I don't want to embarrass her. Okay? But the whole issue that my wife and I have some of the most difficult times with is when she's going 1,000,000 miles an hour to do something, people coming over, whatever, and I sit and ask, is there anything you need me to do? And very often, I don't know where she came up with this and who taught her this, but it wasn't very good. But she'll say something like, seriously? You have no idea what to do, huh? You have no idea what needs to be done. That's not a very honoring thing to say to a husband. I just want you to know. And it's not said in a very honoring way either. And so God's still got a lot of work to do with her. That's why I'm such a patient man. But here's the point. In most cases, when something needs to be done at a church, there's enough people that know it. Why do you sit like an idiot like my wife's husband and say, seriously, do you need any help here? You know? It's interesting. See somebody carrying a great big box and you walk by them, you need any help with that? Oh, okay, fine. Okay, you just leave it. Okay? I've kind of rambled on enough. I just want to tell you, I believe God has great plans for this church. I believe God has greater plans for this church outside the walls of this church. I believe God has got his arms around you. You've been through so much as a church and as a church family that, like Nehemiah, you're in a perfect position right now, this moment, in this day, to rebuild the spiritual walls, not of this church, but of this community, and create a safe place, identity and community, and draw in a new generation of believers of all ages, of all sizes, of all shapes and colors. And some you will never know about till you get to heaven. Herb would have never known about that young lady, I don't think, unless I happened to be getting coffee and spilling a cup, and she just happened to tell me. But when we choose to live out that kind of life, God's going to honor it. And my prayer, not for the sake of you to say, guys, we're having 4 services now, for the sake of God and his glory, that Enumclaw becomes, in the plateau, a safe place for people to say, that's where I would want to live and raise my children, and to see my children's children grow stronger as the men and women of God that he created them to be. It's going to be a great ride. It's going to be a great ride. I love you. Thank you.